What's going on, guys? Ben from JK Gear and Gadgets, and welcome back to another video. We're going to be installing a set of front and rear hydraulic bump stops into the JK. So let's head on into the garage, take a look at these bump stops, talk about what they do, and finally start diving into the install video. All right, let's see what we got here. I'm not going to go too far in depth talking about hydraulic bump stops, what they do, and if you need them. There's a lot of great info online talking about hydraulic bump stops and what exactly they do. But let's do a real quick crash course. Your factory bump stops are attached and welded onto your frame. And during your Jeep's up travel or when you're going down over a big bump, your bump stop is gonna hit your axle, and that's what bottoms out your Jeep. Now, you've probably noticed that in the past. If you went over a big bump and boom, you feel like your Jeep's like falling apart, huge hit, like, man, that did not sound good. That is where hydraulic bump stops come into play. As you can tell, hydraulic bump stops do have room to actually go up. It's almost like a very big heavy-duty shock. These are filled with nitrogen and they are charged really, really heavy. You can't even push this down if you tried. It's gonna take a lot of the weight of the Jeep to start compressing this. So when our Jeep goes down over a big bump or our axle comes up, it's gonna take a lot of weight and start absorbing that impact, cushioning out the ride. Makes it a lot better for off-roading, whether you're rock crawling, doing some high speed, jumps and stuff. It's definitely a great way to enhance your suspension and your Jeep's performance. Now, let's take a look at what we got here for the rear and front. I decided to go with all new bump stops, front and rear, from Locked Offroad. For those of you that have been subscribed to the channel for a while now, you've probably seen my DV8 video, and those bump stops do work well, but it was time to start looking at a solution for the rear bump stops. Went with the TMR Customs brackets for the rear. It is gonna involve cutting and welding, and we'll check that out here in a little bit, talking about why we're gonna have to do that. But these TMR Customs brackets make it really easy to line everything up, and it really adds strength to that rear section where we're cutting and welding to. $99 for the brackets is definitely a great way to do it, and it's fairly affordable. But what bump stops did I go with? Since I was going with the rear, the TMR Customs, really the only options are bump stops that aren't, they're pretty much universal bump stops. So I was looking around, you have King, you have Fox, and honestly, there's a few other ones. However, I stumbled upon Locked Offroad. So I called them up, talked to Riley, the owner. He's a very, very down-to-earth guy. He'll talk to you, tell you exactly what you need, what you don't need, and finding bump stops that will suit your needs the best. So we started talking about the rear hydraulic bump stops. They are this 2-inch body, 2-inch travel, perfect for the rear of a JK. We started talking. I was like, oh yeah, I do YouTube videos, all that stuff. He's like, are you the guy that did the front DV8 install video? I was like, yeah. He's like, I hate you. So the story behind that is that DV8 actually knocked him off. He came up with these a couple years ago to kind of compete with King and Fox, still making a great bump stop, but at a lower price. Of course, DV8 got a hold of them, ripped them off, and pretty much made the exact same product a lot cheaper. That's what DV8 does. And personally, me as a YouTuber and just an avid off-roader, I do not really support companies that do that kind of stuff. DV8 is pretty much, they make very cheap stuff, but however, I really do not like them or support them as a company. So what we have here is a box of front and rear hydraulic bump stops from Locked Offroad. He said he's willing to do 10% off for this video, so go over to lockedoffroad.com, get some bump stops, 10% off using the code JKBumps. But that is enough talking. We have our rear hydraulic bump stop mounts, the actual bump stops themselves, and honestly, these things are just beautiful. The body themselves is black, and it comes with everything we need. We're not going to reuse these this little tube up here for the fronts, but for the rear, we went with the pin mount. It's going to be a lot stronger than some of the other bump stop mounting options, and paired with these brackets, going to make a really nice, clean install. Let's go ahead and head over to the rear and take a look at how to install these. So the first thing we're going to have to do is actually modify the TMR brackets just a little bit. These are designed around the King and Fox bump stops, where the Locked Offroad actually uses a little bit thicker of a can mount, which is a good thing. So if we were just going ahead and put this on right here, as you can tell, there's a little bit of a gap right there. So what we're going to do is grab our grinder and grind down this bracket on the sides until this bump stop can fits nice and flush. All right, that didn't take very long. We are good to go. All we have to do is just grind down a little bit here on the sides, and she fits right in there, nice and snug. We're gonna go ahead and jack up the Jeep to make it a little bit easier to get in here to our bump stop so we can start cutting. If you want, you could go ahead and put the Jeep on jack stands, pull the tire off so you have a little more room. I might do that, but for now, I'm just gonna use the high lift to lift up the back of the Jeep. And as you can tell now, we have plenty of room to start working in here and cutting our bump stops. Now on my Jeep, I already relocated my brake line forward due to the 1-ton swap. If yours is factory, it's gonna run right along here going into this bracket. Go ahead and disconnect your brake line from this bracket, move it out of the way so we can start cutting this bump stop bracket. I'm gonna undo my mount here and just move the brake line right on over. Once our brake line is moved out of the way, we can go ahead and start cutting off our old bump stop mount. Grab our grinder and cut sideways as close to the weld as possible, all the way along here, and then we have to cut the bottom off too. Be careful that you don't cut too deep into the frame. We only wanna cut this bracket off. Definitely takes a lot of time. Take your time and don't cut too deep. We're gonna grab a pry bar and a hammer and go through our cut and bring it out a little bit. Don't get it stuck like me. It's still pretty tight. What I'm gonna do now is make some cuts right down here on the bottom so we can fold it over and get this piece out of the way. Now that we have the bracket removed, we are going to grind all this down nice and flush with the frame, right here on this side as well as underneath. Now that we have the frame nice and clean, it's time to position where we're gonna weld our bracket onto. We're also gonna have to cut out the frame for this notch. Now the reason we have to actually cut out into the frame is because we need to recess the bump stop. On the JK, if we were gonna weld it right here outside the frame, it would hit our upper control arm mount. We need it to go to the bump stop pad, which means we have to cut into the frame. It's really not that big of a deal, and that's why I recommend using these TMR Customs brackets, because we can cut out a section of our frame, weld this back in, and it's gonna bring back all the strength. It's gonna rebox the frame. Now, before we actually position it, we're gonna have to find out where to make that hole. And let me show you a completed hole cut out in the frame. As you can tell, it's a nice little cutout right there. And if we just left it like that or welded the bump stop can right in there, we could possibly lose a little bit of strength. So that's why these brackets are important. But before we figure out where we need to, make that cut, we have to put the Jeep back down on the ground at ride height. Now this step is gonna be different from everybody, depending how far stretched back you are, how much lift height you have, etc. But what I'm gonna do is just put this on right there and kind of visually see how it lines up with the axle. It's hard to sneak the GoPro and my head in here. Now we have to remember that when this axle comes up, it shifts back. So we're gonna position this bump stop. I'm gonna do mine right about there. It's hard to see on the GoPro, but that should be a good location to strike the bump stop pad. We really want to make sure that we make both sides the same, centered. So what I'm going to do, I've already done it, but you measure from, a hole in the frame to the edge and duplicate it both on the same side. So what we're going to do now is grab a Sharpie, mark our lines around here, and start cutting that cutout. Now that we have our cutout made, time to go ahead and put our bracket on, grab our bump stop can, and make sure it all sits nice and flush, which we do. We're good to go. All right, it's time to weld this up. Now what we're gonna do is grab our mount, and as you can tell right here, that little guy, that is where we actually get access in the future to service the, we want this facing forward so we can easily get access to it. And what we're gonna do is just leave a little lip right on top there for us to weld to. Now, just like that, we're gonna go ahead and tack it in place. it's really important not to weld this too much to where this metal distorts and we can't get the bump stop inside. Now that we have our bump stop can welded to the mount, our last thing to do is weld it to the frame, this whole piece. Before we weld to the frame, it's important to disconnect your battery, especially your negative terminal. Disconnect that always before you're welding to the actual frame of the Jeep. So what we're gonna do is grab our bump stop mount. It's gonna slide right in there from where we cut it. Make sure it's flush, make sure everything's good. It's a good idea to go ahead and check, make sure the bump stop actually fits in the can still. If it doesn't fit, you don't want to find out after you've already welded all this to the frame. But mine's good to go. We're gonna go ahead and put a few tacks in and weld it in. We are almost done with the rear. The brackets are burnt in, everything's good to go. We actually have to mount the bump stops now. Luckily, that's the easiest part of this job. And I can't wait to finish the rear up so I can go upstairs, shower, get all this metal off me, so we can go ahead and tackle the front. The front is a lot easier. It's pretty much just bolt in. But as you can tell, the brackets are in there. Went ahead and painted it, and I got that bump in. That's good to go. So we're still jacked up, we're good to go. Installing these is simple. We're just gonna slide it up, align it with the hole in the bump stop can with that little bolt right here, and tighten it up. All right, last turn. You don't have to get these incredibly tight, but get them nice and snug. There we go. Stops are installed. Boom. The brackets make it really easy, super strong, and of course the Locked Offroad bump stops are just really nice. So let's lower this jack down, see what it looks like. You know what? I'm tempted to just let this thing go. Should we? Heck yeah. Never do this with a high lift. Ready? Oh, that was boring. Jeez. All right, there we are. Sweet, so as you can tell, I have about an inch right there and then another 2 inches. So that's like 3 inches of up travel. I'll probably lower down my bump stop to gain a little more, but this is gonna be awesome. I can't wait to get some footage. Probably mount the GoPro right here and hit some nice whoops to see those hydraulic bump stops in action. Now that we have the rear bump stops done, next up is gonna be the front. But I'm gonna go take a shower, get some dinner, and then we're gonna tackle the front. I also have to install my new rock crawler springs, the 3.5-inch coils that I got. So we're gonna do both that at the same time, and honestly, the front is so much easier. Luckily, I've already cut everything. I already have hydraulic bump stops, so I'm just changing it up. However, I'm still gonna show you step by step using some of my footage from my old video. So stay tuned, I'm gonna go clean up. Oh. Yeah, give me 1 minute. I'll be right back. It's time to get started on the front. I feel like a new man. Luckily, the front is really simple. We only have to do a few things. First thing, jack up the Jeep. Second thing, take the wheel and tire off. Third thing, unhook our sway bar. Fourth thing, detach our shock. Fifth thing, lower the axle down and remove the spring. Now, I'm gonna go ahead and remove these old bump stops and we'll pretend that they were never even there. All right, here we are, back to stock. Now, at this point, if you haven't already done bump stops, what you're gonna do is grab a Sawzall or a grinder, measure from this lip right here, about 2 to 2.5 inches up. Grab your Sawzall, make a nice, clean, flat cut. Boom! Now we're left with this. We're gonna grab our grinder, make sure it's nice and flush. We don't want any bad angles, otherwise the bump stop mount, it's just gonna mount crooked and not be good. It's gonna come loose over time. So make sure it's nice and flat. Get a can of spray paint, touch up the cuts we made, and now we're gonna grab our new Locked Offroad bump stop. We're gonna go ahead and loosen the top 2 retainer rings, and we are not gonna be using this sleeve. This is for custom applications where we had to weld this to the frame. Since our Jeep JK already has this little mount in there, we're good to go. We're gonna grab some anti-seize and put a good amount on the threads of the body itself. Run them up the bottom and put some more down on the bottom. Man, that made no sense. Run it up the bottom put more on the bottom. There we go. Oh, it's been a long day. Cutting and grinding really gets to you. Now what we're gonna do is rotate these rings all the way to the bottom. There's two rings. There's one that needs to sit. See how it has that lip right there? Those are the ones that are actually gonna go on the tube. The other flat rings are pretty much just like a lock ring, so that other one doesn't get loose. So here we are, we're just gonna have it just like this. Find that ring I just dropped and simply slide it right up in there, center it, and get this first ring started. Loosen these down a little bit. Now, one thing I noticed from these Locked Offroad ones compared to the DV8 is these actually have a little bit more adjustability, especially if we cut this bump mount up a little bit. And we are gonna grab our top retaining ring and simply put it back on. Now, the great thing is that Locked Offroad actually includes a spanner wrench in their kit. The DV8 kit did not, and I had to go out and buy some cheap, crappy spanner wrench from Home Depot that doesn't work well. What we're gonna do is start off with the bottom. We're gonna tighten this up. And then tighten the bottom ring right behind it. We're now gonna come up to the top and tighten that. And tighten that upper ring. And just like that, our hydraulic bump stop is installed. Super simple. We're gonna go throw our spring back on. One thing I do wanna mention is that if you have your coil spring retainer, you wanna make sure that that is up on top before you put this bump stop in, because it won't make it over these threads right here. But we're gonna check, make sure it's nice and tight. What we're gonna do now is throw on our new springs. Luckily for me, I just got some new Rock Crawler 3.5-inch springs. I'm excited to test those out, so let me go grab those, slide them up, and then throw our lower bump stop pads back in if you're using them. At this point, if we were reusing any bump stops, we can go ahead and slide those back in. It's a good idea to just put back what you had before until you can actually flex your Jeep out and test and see how far this actually compresses when you're fully bottomed out. So let's put these back in, get them snug. We don't want to be pushing our tires up into the fenders. Put our shock bolt back on. And that's pretty much it. So what we have left to do is jack up the Jeep, put the tire back on, put it back on the ground, do the exact same thing on the other side. I'm gonna try to knock that out before it gets dark out. Let's do it. And just like that, we have the front and rear hydraulic bump stops on the Jeep. I'm super excited to go out wheeling. I have a few trips coming up, and I'm really gonna do my best to get some action shots of these actually on the rocks, off-roading, as well as some really high-speed stuff to show you guys how well these work. But there's a few things I want to mention before we close out this video. For the front, for those of you that are running like a lower lift kit, whether it's 2.5 inches, I would recommend cutting a little more off of our spring pad. I would cut about 3 inches probably, just so you have room to mount this hydraulic bump stop up a little bit for those of you that are running lower lifts. There's definitely a little bit of fine tuning and getting everything set right after we install these. But honestly, I've drove it around, it rides a lot better. Even some of the bigger dips on the road, I can already feel it kind of absorbing those. So, should you do bump stops? I would say yes. Personally, I would start with the front first, and then work your way to the rear. The front's a really easy install. You just cut and bolt it right in. Now the rear, we are gonna have to weld and grind and all that stuff, but honestly, it's really not too bad. So, I already mentioned the 10% off discount code, so I wanna say that again. If you guys are in the market for some hydraulic bump stops, you don't need the top of the line race bump stops, but you don't want to cheap out, I'd recommend checking out Locked Offroad. 10% off using the code JK Bumps. I'll put all this info in the video description so you can check it out. But that's pretty much it for this video, guys. Stay tuned. Going out wheeling soon. Gonna get some awesome off-road footage. And I'm really excited to test out this new setup and give my review on the Rock Crawler 3.5-inch springs. Been driving around for about 2 days now with them, and I definitely have some stuff to talk about with these springs. So stay tuned, and like always, guys, keep on Jeeping on.